What is going on, guys? Valkyria here. Today I am very excited to bring you guys the patch balance adjustment preview for February 17th. We just got the notes in the AMs today on February 4th, and I'm excited to share with you guys my thoughts on the patch. Today's balance buffs include Solitaria, Designer Lilibet, Celine and Lilibet being the very notable ones, as well as a slew of other minor buffs and PvE buffs. So without any ado, let's just jump right into it. So number one, right, on the board is Solitaria. So the number one thing with Solitaria is when she's played into heroes like SSB, Green Violet, Archdemon Shadow, right? Her S1, because it's AoE, it usually, still procs Green Violet, still procs Archdemon Shadow, right? So now with this new change, the AoE is an extra attack. Extra attack cannot be countered, which is amazing. So now every time she takes a turn, she is going to S1, and then her extra attack will hit all four on the AoE. This has two big implications, right? One, now she has an additional 75% chance to strip one buff off of one enemy. And then two, the AoE is now an extra attack, which means she's guaranteed to hit 5 times on her turn. So the implications includes this, right? One is if you build her on a crit set, right? She now boosts Challenger Dominion 5 times, right? Which is like a character that's not very often used, but she's still comboed with some cleave teams to one-tap units like Rem. And then the second point being, now she's very good on Fairytale Tenebrious Artifact, which means if you play her in a longer fight, every time she takes a turn, she's layering in like 4,500 to 6,000 damage off of that artifact alone, every time she takes a turn, built with no damage. So keep that in mind. It's a lot of value in a longer fight. Now her passive is the next thing that got changed. So instead of just giving her what it did before, now there's two components to this. At the beginning of her turn, it gives her the buff so that she can do the extra attack. And that does not carry over, which means this doesn't really work on a counter build or any type of like unity build. And the other thing is that at the end of the turn, it grants her a full turn of stealth, which means she's effectively like an Akoli, right? Where as long as, she doesn't get bursted out of her stealth, she is very self-sustainable, where every single turn, she can stealth herself, and if the enemy lacks AoE, she is a great control unit that can punish any lack of AoE on the enemy's draft. The S3, now that the stealth has been moved to her S2 and is permanent, it gives her a barrier scaling to her own max HP, which means she's pretty good when you build her with a higher HP, build her a little tankier. So with the barrier and the stealth, it means at least for 2 turns, if she's not bursted, right, she's not dealt a great amount of damage, she's going to stay stealth quite a long time. And especially if you soul burn her, that's going to lower the cooldown, but she's going to be able to sustain herself and keep herself alive for a lot longer. If you want to play a more control heavy playstyle, you can run potentially Crown, or you can run Ayla Violin, F10 artifact, which all go towards helping players get that long-term value. So she definitely is a lot better now, and into her matches where she's designed to be good, she's very strong. On top of that, she can also initiate for cleaves. She can soul burn her S3 to stun the enemy Politis. Having the CR decrease on her S3 means she could shuffle the turn order for enemy teams, Emil Carrick, Designer Lilibet, things like that, before dropping a S1, which strips a buff, right? Drops an AoE, which could stun. On top of that, right? The AoE would activate things like a Caesarea, and if there's a Caesarea, an Ida can be activated too. But that doesn't limit her to just playing a turn 1 playstyle. She can also be played with the F10 artifact with a standard team, right? She'll be able to keep herself alive, and on top of that, she'll be able to pepper the enemy with chip damage over a long period of time. Designer Lilibet is another really interesting one. I didn't expect her to get buffed because ML Sirmia just got released, right? And they kind of fall within the same classification of heroes. But the buff actually makes a lot of sense because ML Sirmia is kind of a damage unit with low initiative. Designer Lilibet is kind of the opposite now. She is a utility unit with tons of initiative. Right, so they can almost even be drafted alongside each other if you think about it that way. So the change on Designer Lilibet's passive is that every time an enemy's turn ends, she now gains double the fighting spirit per debuff inflicted. Right, previously she starts at 50 and you need 10 debuff inflicted for the enemy to take 1 turn. Generally speaking, enemies are allowed to take 2 turns before she can cleanse. So now she's a lot harder to play around. So historically, one of her biggest weaknesses is that enemies can play around her passive. They could choose to, you know, hold back some debuff or to overload the debuffs, proc this passive, and then reset her fighting spirit and then go again. But because she gains double the fighting spirit now, she's a lot harder to play around. On top of that, gaining 1 turn of defense every time this procs, right? And now it's going to proc twice as often, is going to allow her to survive a lot more things. And then on top of that, whenever she attacks, since she scales with her defense, she's going to hit a lot harder. Now the S3 buff is pretty significant as well, since it increases combat readiness of all allies by 15%. So what this does effectively, because she already increased her own combat readiness with the S2, this allows her to push her allies. Now, playing against Cleave, one of the most effective ways I always try to use when playing against Cleave is to use CR pushers to cut the enemy. This just gives her a much easier outlet to cut enemies. And on top of that, she can push her allies by 15%, which neutralizes any type of like Cesaria push, for example. And this gives players with good mid-speed options to play around Cleaves very, very well. Up next is Blue Chloe. She just got some damage buffs, some CR increase buffs, and she had the cooldown on her S3 lowered. And I think in a PvP sense, it doesn't do much for her, but for something like Wyvern, it kind of equalizes her usage for players who, you know, maybe they don't have a Sigrid or something like that. So it's just a nice little buff to kind of help out with PvE players in general. And on top of that, she can increase her own attack for when she uses Magic Bolt, you know, which definitely help increase her damage output overall for Wyvern. Now, this is where the money in this buff is. Green Celine, I am huge on this buff. I think Green Celine is going to kind of really remove a lot of those oppressive power that previously Cleave had over her. If you think about it, ever since Ran release, Ran Cesaria Cleave has been oppressive for a while now, and there's very little counterplay to that outside of, you know, having like an immunity Green Violet. Having a Green Celine here essentially gives her so much tools to play with that she can counter Cleave, she can help pinch Cleave with the help of Hippolytus, with the help of a Rimuru, right? Because most modern initiators like Ran, Peyra, Lilius use non-attack skills, and with the intention of using it to enable an Ida or a Cesaria, but mostly Idas, right? They use a non-attack skill to help initiate an Ida, right? That is kind of like the most popular modern Cleave. So now the Dispel All debuffs has been moved to her passive, which is one of the biggest things. Now the passive will cleanse all the debuff. This means every time she plays into a Lilius S3s, she's going to cleanse the attack down. Ran S2s, she's going to push up. For a Peyra combo, a Peyra S2, S3, she's going to cleanse that. Or for a Ran is going to S3, she's going to cleanse the defense break on herself, if possible, after Ran Cesaria activates her passive. Now that we're in 2022, we have to think about the game in ways where a lot of these S2s, a lot of these passives are activating and we have to sequence them into each other. So the other significant change is that she got a 20% combat readiness increase, which means in my mind, she's played decently fast now. You play her at 230, 240 speed, put her on Secret Art Storm Sword, even through Hippolytus, she's going to be able to cut a Cesaria and just push herself up to the top. And last but not least, she now grants herself a 2-turn barrier at the cost of some of her healing. But the significant part is the barrier strength increases proportional to caster's attack. We don't have the number on this, but if it's anything like Ervelin's barrier, with an evasion buff, she's going to stay alive for at least, she's going to stay alive for a good while unless there's a solid, you know, increased hit chance character that's being played into her. So I'm very excited to play Celine. I think her builds just kind of like wildly evolved because of all of these extra utility coming in for her. Specifically, now I think she can be played on 2 separate EEs. For her exclusive equipment, you can either play her on the Stealth EE and play her with Secret Art Storm Sword. This gives her better matchups versus things like Ran and Cesaria Cleaves. Or you can play her on the highest enemy attack EE and play her on Wind Rider if you're very confident in your damage and you're running a pen set. Because now I think she no longer needs immunity set since she does a self-cleanse when you draft her into the right setups. So what you can do is play her on Wind Rider, bait a Conqueror Lilius to activate an Ida, and then just kill the Ida. After you kill the Ida, Wind Rider gives you a turn of stealth, and then now she gets to do whatever she wants. And I think like it makes her build so flexible, and there is so many ways she can be played, especially as a non-RNG way to kind of combat all of these new initiators that do a lot to, you know, just bring power to their team. So I'm super excited for this change. Up next is Lilibet. So Lilibet buff is pretty interesting because for her Snip Snip, instead of inflicting 4 bleeds, she now inflicts 3 bleeds at a slightly higher chance, and then increases caster's combat readiness by 50%. But here's the interesting part. If a bleed sticks on the target, right, after your attack, it actually increases her combat readiness by an additional 50%. You know, at first, I didn't think this mattered, right? But the more I thought about it, I think she actually has potential to be played as a aggressive single target nuker. If for no other reason, right? More and more heroes now, more and more teams are playing without immunity, right? Due to Rimuru being so popular and prominent. So a lot of builds are dropping immunity. And when immunity is dropped, and you either build a really fast Lilibet or you build a high damage Lilibet, you know, with a flam push, she's going to be able to tag these units, right, with bleed, cycle back, give herself 100% combat readiness, right, provided there's no politics or anything like that. And she's going to be able to slam her S3. And the S3 got one buff, which is decreased caster skill cooldown by 1 turn when she gets a kill, which now looks a lot like top model Luluka's. And I think this is a very interesting change because the S2 cooldown is already really short, right? She gains another extra turn if the bleed sticks. And then when she gets a kill with S3, which she most likely will because the scaling on this S3 is massive, she's actually going to reduce this by a turn, puts a skill nullifier on herself. And then there's a chance she can loop the S2 again if she ever gets another turn, right? Because once you kill something, right, potentially you're killing 2 things. There's not enough initiative on the enemy team to come back. So if you can actually build her in a draft where she can kind of pop 1 target, ideally 2, she could really pop off. But I think she'll be very hard to use given heroes like Celine, where they do so much to, you know, stop the, you know, the non-attacking skill and CR push for modern, like, aggressive teams. Up next is Sinful Angelica. I don't think Sinful Angelica's buffs are particularly significant, but it does cleanse 1 debuff from all allies before she has 3s. And I think that's okay. It doesn't improve her matchup versus things like Ram, Peyra that are going to outspeed and just kill. But I think she's run with like Angel of Light Angelica. They can dispel 2 buffs in 1 rotation together. And that could enable some really cool ways to play around Control Initiate. So that's not bad at all, but I don't think it does enough to move the needle on where she's at in terms of PvP. Up next, we have Ainos, Lucy, and Adin. They each just got some utility buffs that's going to help them clear their respective PvE content. Not really that much to be said. If you use those units, great. If you don't, they might be slightly better for you over some other free-to-play options. After that, we have the artifact changes. Cradle of Life. So Cradle of Life is always known as a hunt artifact because you put this on a Terranor guard, he dual attacks, he inflicts a lot of debuffs, and if he lands a poison, it's going to do a lot of damage to Wyvern. So 2 changes happen. 1, poison got removed, so it is no longer a good PvE artifact, but the debuff got moved to 2 turns, which now makes it PvP viable. I actually think it's not bad as a controller artifact for PvP, right? Because if you think about how a controller plays, they take their initial turns and then they kind of spend 2 to 3 turns cycling, right? And if they have 2 to 3 turns to inflict like random debuffs, right? If you can get a attack down, a blind, a burn, right? Burns and bleeds matter less on these heroes because they don't generally build attack. But if you have these crowd control ones, right? Decrease attack, miss, right? Sometimes it matters. Like for example, in Ceresa's scenario, one of her best in slot artifacts is Misconfeel. And Misconfeel gives a very low chance, right, granted, to inflict defense break. But when she pulls a unit and it attacks into a defense break target, right, sometimes that just wins you the game by itself. So if you're playing a warrior that is like a control initiator, so for example, maybe like a high effectiveness Judge Kisei or maybe a Mui, this lets them loop, this lets their looping turns have a little bit more utility to them. But overall, I think it'll probably not see much play until a more suitable user is released. A Little Crane Huge Crown. Okay, so this one is really interesting. At maxed enhance, right, now it gives 16% increased damage dealt, period, on a single attack, which is great, right? it basically equalizes it with Merciless Glutton. So now the cool part is that bonus is doubled when you're hitting into an enemy with a barrier. And I think the niche here is that attacking into FCC, right, your Luna and your Zahhak now have a slightly better damage increase to be used that way. But I think overall, most players are just going to prefer Merciless Glutton anyway, because if you're playing a Luna or Zahhak, you're playing very aggressive. And when you're playing aggressively, having like, you know, inherent CR push in your DPS units is very, very valuable. You don't ever want to give that up. And most of the time, right, if you're playing aggressively, you're gonna look to ban their mitigator anyhow. So overall, I don't think Little Queen Huge Crown's needle move too much either, but it does make her a little bit better if you don't have like a merciless glutton, and you need an artifact for a nuker. So overall, I would say it's not bad, but it doesn't do enough. Lastly, we have El's Fist, which is whose fist? I don't think this is gonna see use. You know, they're just going to give, you know, some buffs to a underused artifact, which is, I think, is cool. I think there's probably going to be better artifacts elsewhere, right? But, you know, free 10% attacks, free 10% attack. If there's ever a unit that is good on El's Fist, hey, power to them, right? Overall, guys, I would say this patch is pretty exciting. I think in 2 weeks' time, when these buffs come in, especially, you know, with Cerise, with Solitaria, and Designer Lilibet, as they are going to be, right? Epic 7 is going to look like a slightly different game. Cleave no longer has that like pure oppressive power, especially with Celine being a direct counter to almost every single meta initiator right now. So I think Celine's buff is absolutely 10 out of 10. Designer Lilibet buffs are probably, in my mind, like 7 out of 10, right? It does enough things to affect most of the popular units, but it doesn't do so much that I think she's going to be in every single draft now, right? As far as Solitaria buffs are concerned, in my mind, that's like a 8 to 8.5 out of 10. I think she's she's gonna have a lot more usage as far as, you know, a controller is concerned. I think she could be played in Cleave. I think she could be played in Standard with, you know, F10 artifacts. And I think, you know, she does what she's supposed to do, right? If you're playing into a Green Violet draft, you're playing into a SSB draft, you're playing into a Archdemon Shadow draft, right? You could very reliably bring her out using, you know, with any playstyle, and she could be pretty effective in stopping some of these units now, and, you know, sufficiently protect herself and keep herself alive. Green Lilibet, I think, is 5 to 7.5, depending on, you know, how her numbers change and how the meta shifts. That one's a little hard to say, because if units start moving back on immunity, she's not really that viable as a nuker. But, you know, if units stay the same way, right, where a lot of bruisers are starting to drop immunity now, you can easily play a very aggressive style of Lilibet. She can S2, S3, and start looping herself, right? I think that's quite powerful. Overall, I think Celine and Designer Lilibet helps players equalize like some of the very oppressive power that Cleave and aggressive playstyles have without relying on RNG, right? Which is amazing for PvP, because right now, the most reliable counter for Para and Ran Cleave is Green Violet. And now there are answers that don't rely on Green Violet. I think slower players have ways to like interact, you know, albeit it's through passives, right, with faster players. You know, that doesn't rely on RNG. And now faster players kind of have to make decisions on, okay, do I still go Pepega AoE, you know, S2 animation Cleave, or is this time to shift to a more single target aggressive style Cleave? And it's really going to change up the way like aggressive teams are played in Epic 7. So I'm pretty excited to see how this patch influenced the game. That being said, you know, I want to hear what your guys' thoughts are. If you guys caught something I didn't catch, right? Or if you guys have any other insights, right, regarding maybe stuff I missed, right? Feel free to leave them in the comments. That being said, guys, those are my thoughts on this patch. And yeah, I'm pretty excited for this one. I hope you guys are too. And I'll see you guys in the next video. See ya.
Hey big boys, thank you for the watch. If you like video, be sure to drop the like and subscribe. It really help Uncle Velk out. If you want to catch any of the moment, be sure to follow me at Twitter.tv/Uncle Velk. Also, catch me hang out with friend in the Discord, link in description. For now, I catch you big boy later. See ya.